It began with a photograph, one that should have been ordinary. In the spring of 2023, a renovation crew clearing out an attic in Kraków, Poland, stumbled upon a dusty box wrapped in yellowed newspaper. Inside were old letters, rusted trinkets, and a single photograph sealed inside a cracked glass frame. It showed a smiling family of 4, a father in a wool suit, a mother holding a small girl's hand, and an older boy standing proudly at her side. The back of the image was marked in neat handwriting, Summer, 1943, Nowa Huta. At first glance, it was a familiar wartime family portrait, one of countless faces captured before Europe fell into chaos. But when the photo was scanned for restoration, something appeared that no one expected. In the background, reflected in a small mirror hanging on the wall behind them, was the faint outline of another child, pale, expressionless, and facing directly toward the camera. Historians checked records from the town's wartime census. The family's names were known, the Kowalskis, but they had only 2 children, no third. No missing birth certificate, no mention in letters or diaries. Even more unsettling, the film stock didn't match the supposed date. The photograph's chemical composition suggested it had been developed around 1948, 5 years after the handwriting claimed it was taken. Experts debated whether it was a trick of light, a double exposure, or something more human, a memory that refused to disappear. Forensic analysts found no signs of tampering. The negative, long decayed, offered no explanation. Soon, the image began to circulate among archivists and journalists, each asking the same question: who was the child in the mirror? And why did history forget them? The story that follows isn't about ghosts or superstition. It's about memory, about the way photographs capture not just what we see, but what we try to erase. What if the photograph itself remembered what history forgot? To understand the mystery of the photograph, we must step back in time to a Poland trying to rebuild from ashes. The year was 1946. Across Europe, the war had ended, but its shadow lingered in the form of shattered families, lost children, and unmarked graves. In villages and towns, people searched through archives and Red Cross records for names that no longer existed. The wounds of occupation ran deep, and for many, photographs were the only proof that a family had ever been whole. Decades later, a retired photographer named Jan Kowalski from Kraków donated a collection of film negatives and prints to the local historical museum. He had spent his life documenting the post-war years, weddings, baptisms, funerals, fragments of ordinary life returning after extraordinary pain. Among his hundreds of photographs was one that would soon become infamous, a family portrait marked Summer, 1943, Nowa Huta. The image was first logged as unremarkable until an archivist restoring it for digital preservation noticed something unsettling. In the reflection of a small wall mirror behind the family, the faint outline of another child appeared, a boy, perhaps 6 years old, his face half lit and strangely distinct. The reflection didn't match anyone standing in front of the camera. At first, the museum staff dismissed it as a photographic flaw, a case of double exposure or light bleed. But when they examined the negative more closely, the figure remained clear, consistent, and proportionally accurate. It wasn't an illusion. To investigate further, the museum brought in historian and genealogist Marta Wójcik, known for her work on post-war family reconstructions. Using regional archives, baptism records, and surviving census lists, she began tracing the people in the photograph. Her research led to the Zielinski family, who once lived in a small village outside Nowy Sącz in southern Poland. Records confirmed the parents' names, the dates, and even the home visible in the background. Everything matched, except for one thing. The Zielinskis had only 2 children, a daughter named Anna, born in 1938, and a son, Piotr, born in 1940. There was no third child. No stillbirths recorded, no missing persons reported. Yet the photograph showed 3 faces, and the most haunting part, the mirror boy's gaze was not toward the family, but directly into the lens. By the end of her initial analysis, Marta wrote a single line in her report: "If this image is authentic, then someone once existed, and history chose to forget him." The question remained, who was the boy in the photograph? Marta Wójcik began her investigation the way any trained historian would, with the evidence she could hold in her hands. The photograph was printed on Agfa Lupex paper. Common in Poland in the mid to late 1940s, the ink on the back, a careful, looping script, and read Lato 1942, summer 1942, yet the developing lab's embossed stamp indicated 1947. That 5-year discrepancy was her first red flag. Under magnification, Marta noticed that the photograph's edges had been trimmed unevenly, suggesting it had once been mounted or framed before being cut down. On the bottom right corner, a faint fingerprint was visible beneath the varnish. Not Jan Kowalski's, according to the museum's archive records. Whoever handled this print had done so long before it reached his possession. The next step was to find someone who could identify the people within it. Through regional archives and immigration databases, Marta traced the surviving descendants of the Zielinski family. To her surprise, she discovered that Anna Zielinska, the eldest daughter from the photograph, was still alive, an 88-year-old woman living in Chicago. Her family had emigrated to the United States in 1963. When Marta reached out, Anna agreed to speak. A video call was arranged through Anna's granddaughter. As the image of the old woman appeared on screen, her expression softened at the sight of the photograph. "That's us," she said, pointing to the small figures frozen in sepia. "Mama, Papa, and my brother Piotr. That was taken behind our house near Nowy Sącz. I remember that day," Marta asked gently. "Do you recall anyone else being present?" Anna shook her head. "No, we were only 2 children. There was no third. That house burned in the winter of 1945. Everything after that, it's gone." When Marta mentioned the face in the mirror, Anna grew visibly unsettled. She leaned closer, squinting, and then whispered, "That isn't possible." Forensic analysis conducted at the Kraków Institute of Photography confirmed that the mirror's surface was real and unaltered. The reflection's detail, the contour of the boy's cheek, the catchlight in his eyes, the faint curve of a collar, was too precise to be a photographic glitch. Computer modeling determined that the figure's dimensions and lighting matched the family's angle, meaning he was physically present in the scene. Yet, he didn't appear in any of the negative's other test exposures. It was as if he existed only in that single captured moment. Digging deeper, Marta turned to wartime census documents and parish baptism logs between 1939 and 1944. There, buried among faded ink and misspelled names, she found an entry that changed everything. Michał Zielinski, born March 1941. Presumed deceased, 1943, but there was no burial record, no priest's signature, no corresponding death certificate, just the words "presumed deceased." It was as though the boy had vanished during the height of the German occupation, a time when entire families disappeared without trace. When Marta presented this finding to Anna, the elderly woman's eyes filled with confusion. "My mother never spoke of another child. Never." Marta began to wonder, had Michał been deliberately erased from memory? Or had the trauma of war and loss buried his existence so deeply that even family remembrance had faded? The more she looked at the photograph, the more the image of the boy seemed to shift, not in a supernatural way, but as if its presence demanded to be acknowledged. Her notebook filled with a single question: did the camera record a memory no one wanted to keep? Marta's search led her beyond the family's personal archives and into the vast silence of Poland's wartime record rooms, a labyrinth of files sealed in dust and secrecy. In the dim light of the Kraków State Archives, she began cross-referencing parish logs, wartime census lists, and German administrative records from 1943. It was during this deep archival dive that she found the first real crack in the story. A line in an old military report read, "Region Nowy Sącz, civilians evacuated. Children relocated for Erziehung, re-education." The phrase was chillingly familiar. During Nazi occupation, Erziehungslager, education camps, were part of a state program known as the Lebensborn Initiative. Thousands of Polish children with Aryan features were forcibly taken from their families, given new German names, and raised as if they had always belonged elsewhere. The Zielinski home, according to property records, had been within the evacuation zone. Marta began to suspect that the disappearance of the boy named Michał was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a far greater system of disappearance. Then, one evening, While reviewing digital scans from a separate archive in Berlin, she froze. Among confiscated photographs labeled children, to 1943 Litzmannstadt Region, she saw a familiar face. A young boy stood in a group of uniformed children, his expression blank, his posture rigid. But it was unmistakable. The same high cheekbones, the same eyes, and even the same faint scar across his left cheekbone visible in the mirror from the family portrait. The resemblance was undeniable. Marta leaned closer to the image, her pulse quickening. Could this be Michał? The discovery shifted the entire tone of her research. What began as a family mystery was rapidly turning into a fragment of buried wartime horror. She reached out to Professor Adam Lisiewicz, a historian specializing in child displacement during the occupation. After examining the photos side by side, he nodded slowly. "The features are consistent," he said. "But if this is the same child, then the implications are tragic. Many of these children never returned to their families. Some were deliberately erased from all Polish records." This possibility reframed everything. Perhaps the reflection in the photograph was not a supernatural glitch, but a trace of someone intentionally forgotten, a boy hidden from both history and memory. To understand the family's role, Marta examined local church documents. There she uncovered something unexpected. Records from the parish near Nowa Pusta, signed by Father Jerzy Zielinski, the same man in the photo, included irregular baptismal entries from 1942-1943. Several children listed had no parental names, only a note, "Protected." Further investigation revealed whispered testimonies from locals. Father Zielinski had worked with underground clergy to shelter Jewish and orphaned children, giving them temporary Polish identities. The pieces began to fit. Michał might not have been their biological child at all, but a hidden refugee, taken in during the height of occupation to save his life. If true, it explained the absence of his records, the missing death certificate, and the family's later silence. In a time when discovery could mean execution, omission was protection. Still, one question lingered. If the photograph was taken in 1942, and the hidden child was already gone by 1943, why did the reflection show him older, closer to 8 than 6? When Marta compared facial proportions, forensic imaging confirmed that the reflection's face did appear older by several years. Even more unsettling, the direction of light in the reflection didn't align perfectly with the rest of the photo. The scientists suggested possible optical illusions, maybe double exposure, or a rephotographing error from the 1947 reprint. But none of the tests fully explained why the reflection seemed so present, so defined. Marta began to feel the story breathing beyond the borders of historical logic. She reread Anna's testimony. There was no third child, but maybe Anna truly believed that. Maybe she'd been told all her life that silence was survival, yet the photograph refused silence. It seemed to hold its own memory, an imprint of something once real resurfacing decades later, like a whispered confession. In her notes, Marta wrote, "The reflection doesn't belong to the light of that day. It belongs to something or someone trying to be remembered." By the end of her archival research, the case had transformed entirely. What had started as a curious photographic anomaly had become the story of a family trapped between duty, war, and faith, and of a child who existed in a shadow world between history and erasure. The mirror's boy was no longer just a ghost. He was evidence, and evidence demands to be seen. The photograph, long dismissed as a simple family keepsake, was about to yield its most haunting secret. Marta Wójcik, now months into her investigation, had requested a high-resolution digital reconstruction of the original negative, a final effort before submitting her report. The process involved scanning every layer of the old film, separating chemical deposits, and enhancing microscopic details invisible to the human eye. What emerged was beyond anyone's expectation. The technician called her over, trembling slightly. "There's something else here," he said. On the screen, beneath the grain and cracks of time, appeared a faint double image, two exposures overlapping each other, like one memory bleeding into another. The boy's face was there, but duplicated. In one version, he faced forward as before. In the second, slightly turned as if caught mid-motion, his eyes glancing sideways at someone unseen. The team at first assumed it was a technical error. Perhaps the negative had been reused, or the emulsion had degraded unevenly. But when the file was compared against the known physical texture of the print, a troubling pattern emerged. The second image was not a random artifact. It was deliberate. Subtle brush marks in the emulsion layer suggested tampering, faint traces of a hand that had once worked directly on the negative itself. Someone had merged two moments into one photograph, and whoever did it had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal the manipulation. The discovery reignited old questions. Who had commissioned the photograph? And why? Marta turned back to the archives cataloging Jan Kowalski's life. The retired photographer had been meticulous, leaving behind notebooks, film ledgers, and client lists dating back to the 1930s. In one entry from 1947, she found a cryptic line. Client desperate to preserve all her children in one frame, even those no longer living. Her pulse quickened. The entry was dated just weeks before the Zielinski portrait was taken. The revelation painted a new, heartbreaking picture. What if the boy wasn't a ghost at all, but a lost child resurrected through the desperate art of grief? Post-war Europe was a continent of mourning. Countless families had lost children to disease, deportation, or war. Many sought comfort in spiritualism, seances, or the growing trade of memorial photography. Portraits altered to include the dead alongside the living. Historians interviewed for Marta's report confirmed it was not uncommon for bereaved mothers to request such composites. Some were overt tributes. Others were secret acts of remembrance, known only to those who commissioned them. It was their way of refusing to let history erase their children, said one archivist. They were reconstructing family, not as it was, but as they believed it should have been. If the Zielinski portrait was one such creation, it carried a deeper psychological weight. The boy's image, too vivid, too perfectly placed, wasn't an accident of exposure. It was a resurrection, a final plea for memory. Still, Marta could not shake the uncanny feeling that there was something more. The boy in the enhanced image looked older than the child recorded in wartime photos. The curve of his jaw, the length of his hair, subtly different, as though he had aged years beyond the time of his disappearance. How could a mother include her lost son in a photo? Not as he had been, but as he might have become. It was as if grief itself had imagined him forward, preserving not only who he was, but who he was meant to be. Then came the final breakthrough. When the museum prepared the photograph for display, the curator removed its original wooden frame for preservation, and inside, pressed between backing boards, they found a folded piece of yellowing paper, a letter. The handwriting matched Mrs. Zielinska's known samples. It read simply, "If one day this picture is found, let him be remembered. His name was Michał." The room fell silent as Marta read it aloud. For decades, the mystery had been treated as a supernatural curiosity, a ghost in glass, a haunting frozen in time. But in that fragile note, the story transformed into something far more human. The photograph was never meant to frighten. It was meant to heal. Through the grain and silver of a 70-year-old negative, one mother had defied the erasure of war, and in doing so, created an image that lived on far beyond her. The mirror, the reflection, the impossible boy, they were not the works of spirits, but of memory itself, refusing to fade. The last chapter of the mystery began not in a laboratory, but in the quiet fields of southern Poland, where the Zielinski home had once stood, long ago reduced to moss and rubble. Marta Wójcik arrived there on a grey autumn morning, her recorder and camera slung across her shoulder, the now famous photograph tucked carefully in her bag. The wind carried the smell of earth and rain, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. What had once been a family's farmland was now a field of silence. Only fragments remained: a low stone wall, the base of a chimney, shards of porcelain hidden beneath the soil. To anyone else, it was just another forgotten ruin. But Marta knew this ground still held answers. Local elders, cautious at first, began to speak when she showed them the photograph. One old woman, her hands trembling, whispered, "The hidden boy. We all heard the stories. Your picture. It's him." She explained that during the occupation, the Zielinskis had sheltered a child who wasn't their own. Rumor said he was Jewish. Others claimed he was the farmer's illegitimate son, born of an affair with a refugee woman who died during the war. Whatever the truth, the villagers knew only this. One night in 1944, the Gestapo came searching. By morning, the boy was gone. Marta spent hours cross-referencing church registries, baptismal lists, and wartime burial records. Most were incomplete, names missing, pages warped by time. But in one registry from the nearby parish, she found a single cryptic entry. A burial dated June 17, 1944. The grave marked only with the initials MZ and no further explanation. The priest's notes, faded but legible, read, "Child unidentified, buried quietly at request of local family." It was enough. A modern forensic team, in cooperation with Polish heritage authorities, conducted non-invasive ground scans of the site. Beneath the earth, near the remains of what had been the cellar, the instruments detected an anomaly. A small coffin-shaped void, less than a meter deep. The excavation was done slowly, with reverence. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a young boy no older than 6. His bones were delicate, his burial modest. DNA tests followed, though Marta already felt the truth long before the results returned. Weeks later, the report confirmed what history had hidden. The child's genetic markers linked partially to the Zielinski bloodline. Not a stranger, but kin, faintly related, a half-sibling. The pieces fell into place with chilling precision. Michał Zielinski was not an adopted orphan or a ghostly presence in the mirror. He was the secret son of Father Zielinski, born during the war from an affair with a displaced woman who likely perished before liberation. To protect both families, his wife, his surviving children, and the boy himself, the father hid Michał under a false name. But when the Gestapo raid came, the secret collapsed. The boy died, hastily buried under initials instead of a name. And the family, shattered by shame and fear, erased him from memory until one act of defiance brought him back. The photograph was no accident, no haunting. It was a confession. The mother's silent acknowledgement of the child she could not name, and the husband's final attempt at penance. By including Michał's face in the portrait, they had restored the family's truth, even if history could not. When Marta presented her findings to the museum board, the room was heavy with stillness. The story had shifted again, no longer a tale of ghosts but of guilt, love, and remembrance buried beneath decades of silence. She closed her report with a simple statement: the photograph is not evidence of the supernatural, but of something far more human, the persistence of memory and the need to be seen, even after death. The museum decided not to sensationalize the discovery. Instead, the image and its accompanying documents were placed in the National Archives under a new title: The Lost Son of Zielinski, A Family Restored. Marta stood one last time by the grave marked MZ before returning home. The grass had begun to grow back over the disturbed soil, the earth reclaiming what had been revealed. She left a single photograph, a print of the restored image, propped against the headstone. The boy's reflection, once confined to glass and silver, now rested where it belonged, beneath the open sky of the homeland that had once hidden him. 80 years after his death, Michał Zielinski was finally remembered. News of the discovery spread quietly at first, a few museum bulletins, a regional newspaper headline, and then slowly, through Poland's historical societies and online genealogy forums. But once the story reached the International Archives, it took on a life of its own. They called him the missing child of the mirror. Historians, journalists and artists alike found something hauntingly universal in his story. The image of a ghostly boy reflected in glass, once dismissed as a trick of exposure, became a symbol for an entire generation lost to war, displacement, and silence. Across Europe, families began reopening old albums, searching the corners of faded photographs for faces they'd tried to forget or had never known existed. In Kraków, the Museum of Memory became the epicenter of quiet pilgrimage. Visitors would stop before the restored photograph, a modest frame under soft light, and linger in silence. The museum resisted calls for dramatization or digital enhancement. The curators believed the power of the image lay in its imperfections, the grain of old film, the uneven exposure, the faint, almost tender presence of a child reflected in a mirror that no longer exists. Documentary teams revisited the case, but Marta Wójcik declined most interviews. She said there was nothing more to add. Sometimes, she told one historian, photographs are truer than people. They hold emotions deeper than facts, grief that no language can express. Her words resonated. The photograph did not just reveal a mystery solved. It revealed the layers of what memory hides: guilt, love, and the unbearable weight of silence. In wartime Europe, countless stories like Michał's were buried without names, lost between official records and family shame. His rediscovery became a quiet act of collective mourning, a reminder that even one remembered face could stand for thousands forgotten. Months later, the Church of St. Mary in Kraków held a small vigil. The pews were sparsely filled, a few museum staff, local parishioners, and one frail woman in her late 80s, Anna Zielinska. She sat in the front row, a single candle flickering beside her. When the priest spoke the name Michał Zielinski aloud for the first time in nearly 80 years, Anna began to weep softly. Between the prayers, she whispered, "He was always there. We just couldn't see him." After the service, Marta watched her leave, slow, deliberate steps down the church aisle, her hand brushing the photo one last time. Today, the photograph hangs permanently in the Kraków Museum of Memory, marked by a small brass plaque, Michał Zieliński, 1938-1944. Found, remembered, never forgotten. Visitors rarely speak while standing before it. Some say they feel watched, others say they feel forgiven. And in that silence and between the living and the lost, the boy in the mirror still remains. No longer missing, but finally seen. Why do old photographs haunt us? Because they hold still what time has long since let go. Faces, gestures, fleeting truths. They preserve not only what was seen, but what was felt. And sometimes hidden inside their quiet frames lies the truth we were never ready to face. The story of the missing child isn't about ghosts or miracles. It's about the fragile ways memory protects us, how we rewrite what hurts until the edges blur. The Zielinski family, like so many others, carried their silence as survival. The photograph merely waited, patient, watchful, until the world was ready to see what it had always shown. In the end, what we uncover in an old image is rarely just history. It's our reflection, the proof that love, guilt, and grief can coexist in a single captured moment. Maybe Michał was never truly lost. Maybe he lingered quietly inside the silver grains, waiting for someone to look closely enough to remember his name. Because photographs do more than preserve the past. They remind it to be found.